The reason for slavery's persistence is simple. Prison labor currently produces more than $2 billion worth of goods and services every single year in the United States. This corporate trick of using inmates to reduce labor costs goes all the way back to the passage of the 13th Amendment, when plantation owners were forced to replace previously free slave labor with a comparable alternative. The solution? Criminalize poor people, and especially people of color, and throw them in prison, and then use the 13th Amendment's legal slavery clause to turn a profit off of their incarcerated bodies. This was the history that followed Reconstruction in the United States, especially in southern states. And it worked great to make racism mostly invisible, because black folks weren't being arrested for being black. They were being arrested for not having money, or for failing to pay their bills, or for some other weak charge that made it possible for others to pretend it had nothing whatsoever to do with race. And once arrested and convicted, according to the 13th Amendment, these convicted slaves could be leased out to many of the same plantation owners who had previously been forced to house and feed them. Now all they had to do is write a check to the prison, or in some cases, directly to the warden. Wink, wink. Let's back up and talk about why convict leasing has always been and continues to be such a problem. When you go to work, at a factory or an office or a restaurant, it doesn't matter. When you go to work in the United States, you are afforded certain rights and protections. If you walk into a dangerous situation and are hurt because of the negligence of your employer, you can sue them. If you're harassed or repeatedly passed over for promotions, which you deserve, there are internal and legal mechanisms for making things right. And all of this infrastructure cost employers tons of money. HR departments, legal fees, arbitration sessions, sensitivity trainings. From a capitalistic perspective, it would be much better to avoid that hassle altogether. You see where I'm going with this? U.S. courts have repeatedly ruled that prison labor falls outside of typical employee protections provided by the Constitution, that prisoners do not have a constitutionally protected interest in their prison jobs. Based on this ruling, prisoners are denied all sorts of rights that are guaranteed to other employees in this country, including minimum wage, worker protection rights, anti-discrimination laws, and regulations regarding safe working environments. Prison officials can regulate and even restrict prisoner petitions requesting improvements in living or working conditions. They can restrict the formation of unions on the assumption that their very existence would threaten prison security. They can remove a lot of the expensive protections that organizations must usually contend with to do business. And they can do it all invisibly because we usually don't think of such intangibles as part of the cost of doing business, at least not from the outside looking in. But they are. So private industry finds itself in an awkward spot. They must choose pesky and expensive legal requirements designed to protect and compensate employees, or the laissez-faire system offered by utilizing cheap, non-employee prison labor. So let's talk about prison labor in the United States. What happens when you go to prison? One of the most surprising things about my incarceration was the requirement to work. As soon as I was logged in and pushed through quarantine, I was required to keep a job or face punishment. And that punishment was no joke. It involved lockdown in your cell 23 hours a day for at least a few days, and maybe for as long as I had refused to work, possibly my entire prison sentence. It also would have meant a security level increase, including transfer to a less cozy prison with less privileges. And most importantly, it would have meant a rule violation on my permanent record, an infraction which would have been considered when I went to see the parole board, even if that wasn't until years later. And my prison was not unique in its requirement to work. In fact, inmates are required to work in every state in the United States. And it's a good thing, at least for the prison. They couldn't operate without us. They don't hire anyone to do all of the things that you would think are probably taken care of by outside contractors. Instead, inmates run the kitchen, wash the laundry, clean the floors, paint the walls, mow the lawn, mend and hand out clothing, and even lead group help meetings like AA or NA. In the United States, incarcerated people literally build and maintain our own prisons. Not all prison jobs are created equally. 3 basic types of work assignments are offered to inmates, but the most common jobs are those that keep the machine running smoothly. These jobs also receive the lowest compensation. My first job was to pop my head and hands through a garbage bag and then spray food off of dirty trays for 6 cents per hour. And apparently that 6 cents was pretty good compared to how bad some inmates have it. As of this recording, 4 states, Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, and Alabama, still pay inmates nothing at all for working internal prison jobs. But the consequences for refusing are as real as ever. Does this sound like slave labor yet? To keep it simple, let's call these internal jobs Tier 1 jobs, the employees who keep the institution running. If you keep your head down, bust your ass, and follow the rules, you might be selected for a Tier 2 job, working with prison-run industries to produce products that can only be sold to government agencies or to nonprofit organizations. And business is booming. In 2016, 18,000 inmates were employed by Federal Prison Industries, or Unicor. They make all sorts of stuff. Check out their website, unicor.gov, to have your mind blown. A quick list of their products, which, again, are only available to government organizations and nonprofit organizations, include desks, chairs, street paint, ammunition, uniforms, office supplies, custom plaques and signs, storage racks, beds and bedding, and I could go on, all produced and sold at discounted rates, all on the backs of inmate labor. Remember, these products are not supposed to be sold to the public. They're only available to government organizations or to nonprofits. This means that the government can build a chair or a desk or a whatever you like for the same cost as a big corporation, but do it without having to pay employees or without turning a corporate profit. So they can purchase a chair for less than you or I, based on the use of slave labor. The Federal Prison Industries program began in 1934. But since then, the states have taken notice of the federal government's success in stacking the books with cheap supplies produced by unpaid labor. Many states have followed suit and implemented similar programs which operate out of state in local facilities. Colorado Correctional Industries employed 1,800 inmates in 2016, fighting wildfires, milking cows, harvesting crops, manufacturing equipment, training dogs, recycling, and even repairing furniture. California employs almost 7,000 inmates in its prison industry sector, selling clothing, food products, office furniture, shoes, printing, eyewear, license plates, signs, binders, and cell phone equipment. These positions pay a little bit more than in-house prison labor Tier 1, but still nowhere near the minimum wage mandated outside of prison. I'll break those numbers down in just a minute. A small portion of inmates, hand-chosen after making their way through Tier 1 and Tier 2, become workers in capitalistic partnerships between prisons and outside organizations. Whole Foods has sold dairy products that come from prison farms. McDonald's has used employee uniforms manufactured by prisoners. Victoria's Secret has used inmate labor to manufacture lingerie. AT&T has staffed its call centers with prisoners. And British Petroleum hired inmates to help clean up the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. All Tier 3 jobs fall under the guidance of something called the Prison Industries Enhancement Certificate Program. This nasty piece of federal legislation that does little more than prevent cheap prison labor from giving a few companies an unfair advantage against the competition. It does nothing to help inmates stay safe, to protect their rights, or to help them prepare for the future. So the prison, filled disproportionately with people of color and with poor folks, is built and operated by inmates who work for little or no pay. Once they saw legal free labor putting money into the coffers of the federal government, in this case by getting underpaid inmates to maintain our own prison, the rest of the government wanted a piece of the slave labor action, so federal and state prison industries put prisoners to work producing anything and everything that the state might need, all at a price that could be discounted based on the slave labor that produced it. And since the state is always looking out for the interests of the rich and powerful, society's movers and shakers, private business owners also got a piece of the action with Tier 3 jobs. And the only reason it goes largely unchecked is because the labor force is, as Michelle Alexander has said, felons, the one group in the United States whom we have permission to hate. Power is always at work in our environments, but when we're in prison, it's thick and rich, it's inescapable. We're always being watched, directed, programmed, evaluated, and recorded. But prison is also a hegemonic system. That's a big word, but it just means that it operates by getting the participants to endorse the system that oppresses them. Hegemonic systems are incredibly difficult to weed out once they take root, because they play a mental trick on those they take advantage of, in this case, prison inmates. Think about this. We're locked in a prison cell or a small cubicle for the majority of our day. We have few books and no good television. We can't call our family member or friends without spending huge amounts of money. We can't go to the movies or go ride go-karts when we're bored. We're in prison. It is so boring. So when a prison official comes along and offers us a job, usually after months of wallowing in boredom, it isn't hard to jump at the opportunity. Sometimes we'd work for free. Sometimes we do work for free. Or for a few candy bars we can buy at the end of each month with our meager wages. It's not because we're idiots. Prison inmates are some of the smartest and definitely the most ingenuitive people I've ever met. It's that the system is built in such an ingenious fashion that the only way it can work is if the oppressed get on board with their own oppression. They torture us into submission. They let us see the other side, the boredom of staring at the wall for 23 hours, the gears starting to slip as you lose track of time and fall into a pit of depression. These jobs are lifesavers. Of course we want them. And we shouldn't get rid of them, we should fix them. These jobs provide an incentive for inmates to behave and an opportunity to prepare us for reentry. You know, it's easy to forget that more than 95% of all prison inmates will eventually be released. If we really want them to succeed, we should keep them acquainted with raises and promotions, unionization practices, fair employment standards, safe work environment norms, and grievance procedures unique to the work environment. In addition, even minimum wage at a steady rate for years of incarceration would provide a huge nest egg for release, a bump start for reentry for some of these felons. As it currently stands, inmates with Tier 3 jobs, the least common jobs available to the fewest inmates, are the only employees who receive minimum wage income requirement protection of any sort. But don't go feeling all silver lining just yet, because even those inmates seldom see their hourly wages reflected in their paycheck. Some states garnish up to 80% of an inmate's wages for court costs, parole fees, restitution, child support, medical bills, dental work, and even rent. That's right, they force them to pay rent to the prison. And it gets worse, because this isn't an issue that history is slowly repairing. It isn't like inmates used to be paid nothing, and now they're paid a little bit, and they're slowly gaining higher wages each year. Not at all. It's the exact opposite. Prison officials have spent the last 15 years reducing the amount paid for Tier 1 jobs, from an average of 93 cents per day in 2001 to an average of just 86 cents per day in 2017. And don't forget that in some states, these inmates are still paid nothing at all, zero, even though they are required by prison regulations to complete any job assignment they are given or to face consequences. For those inmates who are offered jobs in federal or state-owned industries, Tier 2 jobs, the pay is only slightly better and still a complete joke, between 33 cents and $1.44 an hour before deductions. And even in Tier 3 jobs, where companies are legally required to compensate inmates at rates similar to those paid for the same work outside of prison, wages are reduced by up to 80%. Rent, court costs, and fees are the new sharecropper's tax. The prison commissary is the new plantation mercantile. Let's unpack that statement. After the 13th Amendment, slavery was redefined under a different name, and sharecropping became a new method for white landowners to maintain their wealth and domination over recently freed black folks. Landowners would sell their so-called hired help, often the same folks who had recently been their slaves, everything from seed to personal supplies, on credit and at inflated rates. The system was designed to ensure that little or no money remained after the harvest was collected months later and the books were settled. In the contemporary prison-industrial complex, the recipe is much the same. Indefensibly low wages, or sometimes none at all, are paid to inmates, who can then purchase essential items from the prison commissary, yet another leeching monopoly that makes an estimated $1.5 billion every year in profit. In prison, you have to purchase your supplies from the prison store. They're the only provider in town. It gets worse. If you want to talk to your people on the phone, you have to purchase phone time or call collect at rates as high as $1 per minute, a monopoly on human connection that nets private telecom companies an estimated $1.2 billion per year. And since they're felons, you know, those terrible criminals we're all allowed to hate, the shafting goes unnoticed, even though much of prisoners' money comes from those outside of prison. Prisoners are also charged a fee to see a doctor or a dentist in prison, and private healthcare provider brought in $1.4 billion worth of revenue in 2016, for contracted medical health service provided to U.S. inmates. This isn't far from the historical image of the overcharged sharecropper, the laborer who is permanently indebted to the only mercantile that will take their credit, the fully updated legal version of sharecropping. After paying 80% to the landowner for rent and taxes, the remainder can be used to purchase items that are essential to human comfort. Soap, drawers, headache medication, maybe a pillow. Things that you can't really do without, but which become luxuries when you're in prison. The blueprint is pasted straight from the plantation. Use the state's legal authority to convict poor people and people of color at excessive rates, and then lock them up near locations where you can put them to work for minimal or non-existent wages.